back, everybody. It's Fundraisers Friday with Tony Beall, Mr. Nonprofit Consultancy. Woohoo!
Happy Friday, Julia. It's great to see you.
Great to see you. In the green room, we were talking about the new Madonna CD or LP, whatever you want to call it, release. And I feel like that vibe of her music is perfect with the title of our episode today, because we're talking about a balancing act, and we're talking about, are we asking too often or not enough? Right?
Yeah, is Madonna too much or not enough? So
Exactly. I mean, in my way of thinking, she is not too much at all.
not too much.
I'm just speaking for myself. But yeah, so I kind of like this whole thread of where we are, what we're talking about, and it's really a really important issue, especially where we are. If you're watching this live, this is the time of year with so many folks thinking about how are they going to move through to Q4 and what are they going to be asking for, and that's could be very precarious. What's not precarious are our relationships we have with our partners. They include Boomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, and your part-time controller, along with Intuit QuickBooks. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy, with Mr. Nonprofit Consultant himself of Mr. Nonprofit Consultancy, the amazing Tony Beall. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you, Julia. That was definitely a mouthful there. Yeah, it's Friday. I mean, I can't believe it's Friday again, and here we are, having the opportunity again, thanks to our sponsors, to have some incredible conversations. And like I always say about, being part of this show, which I'm so honored to be a part of, I always hope that we're inspiring folks or, motivating them, and in some cases, giving them permission to think differently or to act differently, or to, just look at things through a different lens.
I love that. And I think that's just a great way to live. I also think that what you just articulated is kind of like one of the foundational pillars of how we work through the nonprofit show. Because Kevin Pace, our executive producer, that was one of his big words when we started on this project, was inspiration. He's like, when we came up with just a vocabulary of where we wanted to be, and inspiration, I think, was his number one word. I mean, I'm not putting words in his mouth, and he is here today with us, but I think that's what he said. So
yeah, great.
The global edition, we have started this. It's very interesting. If you are an organization that's ever thought about doing international work, how to do it, how to expand it, what donors and NGOs and the spirit of philanthropy looks like around the globe, this is an episode for you. It's co-hosted with Matthew Murray. He is based in the UK. These have been really interesting episodes, so go ahead and check those out. Okay, we're going to start with this concept, the confusion between frequency and fatigue. We were talking about this, Tony, in the green room. I think a lot of times we have development on one side of the table, and they're like, oh my God, we're pushing out too much stuff. And then we have donors on the other side of the table saying, oh, really? I didn't think I got enough, right? And so how do we strike that balance between what we're pushing out, whether it be digitally, snail mail, marketing, and then how do we kind of balance that? And I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I was glad that we were able to talk about this a little bit in the green room, because it is something that, when I reflect on my experience, and even in some of the work that I'm doing today, if I'm looking at, launching multiple campaigns throughout a calendar year, I'm like, is that too much? I mean, is that too many campaigns? And then, each one of them has a marketing timeline to support it, pre and post. If there's, like a particular, like if we're talking about Giving Tuesday, for example, right? You have your pre-marketing, then Giving Tuesday happens, and then you have your post-marketing for that. But that's a campaign that requires that kind of planning. So thinking about the frequency is important. Who those audiences are going to be is important also, because you don't always send every piece of communication to the exact same audience. Right. So to be mindful too about how you're segmenting. And I think that's where the fatigue can come in sometimes, Julia, when we think about the work that we do. The fatigue meaning, I'm sending out 8 constant contact communications in the next 2 weeks. That seems like a lot. But if your recipients are segmented and your messaging is specific to those different audiences, then it's really not too much.
Right.
And you don't have to worry about it. So it really is a lot about the way in which you approach your communication, if it is segmented or not segmented, whether or not the frequency is too much. And of course, if you're getting feedback from your recipients, if you're getting a lot of people that are unsubscribing, then that in itself is kind of a good indicator that you might be over communicating, or perhaps, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later in our conversation, or perhaps your messaging is too redundant. It's the same thing. So it's not really that you're communicating too much. It's just that what you're communicating is redundant. And so that I'm talking a lot, but lastly, and I've done this where I would seek out volunteers, especially for digital communication. And I would add them to the different lists, and they would almost serve as an auditor. Meaning they would receive, I wasn't expecting them to donate. They were really volunteers that were just being mindful to look at whatever was coming out from the organization. And then they were kind of a barometer.
Right.
So they could reach out and say, that seemed like a lot to receive in 1 week, or, it's been 10 days and I haven't seen anything. Now I feel like I'm I've been separated from the messaging for too long. So if you can have volunteers that might serve as auditors when it comes to the frequency, that's a value also.
And I love that word, because that puts you in the position of getting feedback, not only from content, but did the email work? Is it all garbly? What time did it come? What day did it come in? That type of digital communication is where the marketplace is really going. And so we have people seeing things, they're not just going to their mailbox, right? They're going to their phone email box. They're going to their laptop, their tablet, their desktop. I mean, it's coming in a lot of different ways, and you think it's the same message, but it doesn't look the same.
Yeah, it's receiving information on your watch. I mean, it's.
Well, I didn't even add that. You are right. You are right.
No, you named so many of them, and and again, it's important for us to be so mindful of how folks are digesting information the various ways. It's
really
remarkable.
Crazy. So we have this confluence of asking, of connecting, of this digital side. Can we jump into the issue of stewardship between these pieces of action? And the reason why I want to talk about this briefly is that this is a heavy lift for a lot of organizations. And it seems like you're just working to get that message out. Maybe you're using a partner, or you're using a CRM, or it's some sort of technical piece. How do you find time to steward in between those activities? Because you don't just push a button and get all this out to your group, right?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, there's certainly, and we see it, and you can almost tell now when folks are leaning into technology and using OpenAI to help support a lot of their communication. So I would say the tool is there, and you should absolutely use it. Just be mindful of how the messaging may be perceived, in that you didn't really invest any time making it personal. So just make sure that it still has your flavor and your tone and words that you would actually use. So there are tools to help with support that. Again, volunteers are a great way. When we're talking about stewardship, you can have volunteers that can help write thank you cards. These are great opportunities, especially after some sort of campaign, or after some sort of event where you want to follow up with some sort of personal message that's going to be more meaningful than something that that lands in an inbox. There was another part of that, Julia, that I have forgotten that you had mentioned.
Well, I just think that we work so hard to get these actions delivered in place from our offices. And I love that you brought up that issue of stewardship, using your donors with maybe a handwritten card or note. It does, as I always say, it doesn't have to be a novel. It needs to be branded. It needs to demonstrate, that you have been thoughtful enough to communicate. And I just think it's a great way to add some personal touch and personality to
Mhm.
that stewardship and to that relationship.
Well,
Because
I remembered what I was going to say, and that is that you have to be very intentional. And so
yeah,
that means you have to block out the time, you have to schedule the time for these activities. I do thank you cards every Monday morning. So
mm,
there is scheduled time in my week where that is my entire focus is writing thank you cards. I went to an event a couple of weeks ago. It was kind of a networking event for an association here. And there were 6 people at my table, not including me. And I wrote them all a thank you card.
awesome.
I mean, I just
Ah,
wrote them a note. It wasn't really a thank you, but it was a branded note that just
yeah,
said it was really great meeting you, and I loved learning something new, you know,
yeah,
with you by my side, or those kind of messaging. So, not even a
yeah.
donor, who knows, but just
A
just taking the time and scheduling it, and just
yeah.
making it part of your routine, if you will.
Well, President Bush Senior's Thousand Points of Light Foundation was generated from the practice that he had of writing 10 notes every night at the end of his day.
Wow.
And it was just like, I heard about your project. Good luck. It was great. It wasn't, it was profound in that you were getting a note from, a leader, of course, and he had his team, and his team helped him, but it was a handwritten note. And
Yeah.
from that, it became literally the Thousand Points of Light, because it
Uh,
was like all of these different people united in doing good. They might not know one another, but they were doing good for their communities and their country. And so
sure.
I think it's really important. Okay, let's talk about determining the value of communication and content. And this goes to our theme. Are we asking enough? Not, too often, asking for too much. You brought this up when I first met you, and I thought it was so profound, because unfortunately I didn't always follow this path. And your comment was, as a fundraiser, and I've just been a community fundraiser, not a professional fundraiser. Um, it's not always about the ask. It's about the relationship and the value of your intent. Can
Oh,
you remind us about this and
well,
what we
yeah. I mean, I think back to when I first started my fundraising career, and I had the pleasure of working with Tracy Allen Shore, and Tracy is one of our board members with AFP Broward, and uh, and she was the first one. And this was really, Julia, before anybody was talking about relationship driven fundraising, and the importance of relationships. I mean, Tracy just is that person. She has always found the value in having strong relationships with folks inside of the workplace and outside of the workplace. But she, to me, is the queen of stewardship. But she was the first one that really, I remember being in her office once, and she was mailing a donor an article that she had ripped out of Food and Wine about some new vineyard in
good.
California that was producing some red wine. And this donor was a red wine drinker and loved red wine. And Tracy knew that. So she
Mhm.
just put a little sticky note on it that said, saw this article, thought you'd love it, hope all
Mhm.
is well, and mailed
Yeah,
it off to the
yeah,
donor. I mean, and I just got goosebumps. I mean, that's the level of stewardship that we should aspire to when it comes to stewarding our donors in between the asks. And that's where kind of this part of our conversation started, was
yeah.
what are we doing, and what is the frequency, and what are we communicating
Mhm.
in between those times when we're making an ask. Because every single piece of communication, although there may be a subtle link to something, It cannot be all about raising money. There are times where we need to really share how we're fulfilling the mission, and what are some of the just some of the outcomes of the work. What is the data showing, and are we, what are the projections? We might need to send out communication that says, based on X, Y, and Z, we're projecting that we may have to serve 20% more community members,
right?
6 months down the road, and that education. So, think about how you're educating folks in between the time when you're actually making an ask.
Yeah, I think it's I love that you talked about that. And I think that this is that time too where we communicate thought leadership. There's so much data that's being released, and there's a way for you to share that with your donors as well, to say, wow, we just heard about this amazing study and it looks like this is a trend. Or our governor or our mayor just brought this up. Did you see this show or this piece on PBS or the evening news, whatever the heck, right?
Right.
I think that those are ways to communicate and engage. I would also remind everybody that hopefully you have a strong CRM, because don't you agree, Tony, that note that went in about the vineyard in California, that should have been input into the CRM saying, very, very quickly, just send a note off about this article from Food and Wine, right? I mean,
yes,
do you think that's got to be documented?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the deep value of CRMs is to be able to track that activity. Yeah. Because, to your point, we're doing a lot of things every day, and we're managing a lot of different relationships and existing ones, ones that we're developing. And who knows, next month in Food and Wine magazine, there may be an article about another vineyard producing red wine. And I might see it and want to send it to the same donor, but I'll go into the record and see Tracy sent one last month about a vineyard. So it's a little redundant for me to send another one. So I'll either skip that, or, maybe I'll send them something else that would be meaningful, that, is a touch point.
Right.
That's really the deep value of the CRMs, is to be able to really track kind of, the journey and all of the different touch points.
Right. I think it's really powerful. And I also think that, for those leaders that move on or change their portfolio or their organization, that is a value that that's a professional value that you need to leave behind your organization. That to me is an ethical almost imperative, that you have to leave your organization with that information, so that somebody else can pick up the ball and run down the field.
Sure.
This one, I warned you in the green room, I struggle with this next question and issue, and that is asking, and maybe understanding is a better word, how donors want to be communicated with. And so this is the question. Well, do you only want to get text? Do you want to get email? Do you want to get snail mail? Do you want to get phone calls? Blah, 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 blah. And to me, Tony, I love this concept in theory, but I just sure as hell can't figure out how you do it when you're trying to do everything else. This just seems like a heavy lift for almost any size organization. And I'd love to get your feedback on this, because this is something that we keep hearing about. You need to know how your donors want to be communicated with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how. I love the theory. I don't see how we can put it into practice.
Well, and you can't for every single donor. So that's why when I mentioned segmentation of your communication strategy is important. So, maybe I need to make sure I understand how our top 10% of donors want to be communicated. The methodology in which they want to receive information. So maybe I'm only addressing that with my top 10% of donors.
Okay.
So that I think that's where that's right. No, because it's true. You would love to be able to do that for everyone. I mean, absolute. Gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to say that? I know how every single donor would prefer to receive information, and I'm able to live by that for them. But that's just not the case for most organizations. So think about, what is it really that important to folks? just kind of based on feedback that you're getting, or are they unresponsive? And so, you might want to reach out to them and say, I've sent you a couple of emails. I didn't receive a response. Should I in the future call you? Should I in the future send you a text? So again, maybe just break it down to the level of donor and start there.
I love it because you just automatically dropped my blood pressure and took the stress away. Because I was thinking like all or nothing. And I love that the top 10%. Thank you. This is why you are such a genius on Fundraisers Friday. Okay. This is another, I'm going to call this a Tonyism. You brought this up in a couple episodes ago when I was asking you about, this kind of, which led us into this topic. Are we asking for too much? Are we leaving money on the table? How do we figure this out? And you had this amazing donor question prompt. And I really think it's super powerful. And you used the word feel, and you said to start a conversation or a part of the conversation to just say, how would you feel about? And then that can help give you a range. I was like, oh my God, why didn't I think of this myself? Because it's natural, it's authentic, it's very honest.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what else to say. I don't, but it's true. It's a great opener. And when you're discussing kind of the level of investment with a donor, and that's where this came from, is us talking about, I have a donor that's giving me a certain amount of money, but there are a lot of indicators that suggest that they may be able to invest more. And so I would start the conversation by saying, how would you feel if I were to ask you to increase your donation to a certain amount, or, just how would you feel if I were to share with you that we're embarking on a new initiative and we're going to be looking for donors to give us, a minimum of $20,000 for that initiative? How would you feel if you were to be part of that group that was asked to participate in that? So I'm not asking them to do it. I'm just saying, how would you feel if you were put in that scenario? And you get some interesting questions. I mean, some interesting answers.
I think the thing about this, Tony, was, and I brought this up since I think you said this maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, as one of the episodes. And since that time, and I meet with people all day long and chat with people, I've asked them about this. Have you ever considered using this tool or this prompt? And everybody has said it immediately reduced their fear of asking. I thought that was fascinating because, we forget that you can have a lot of fear as a fundraiser going in. It's really stressful. And so for me, this prompt just changes the tone. Changes the tone. I just love this.
And it's a great open-ended question.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
well, I'm glad people are finding some value in kind of framing their conversations by using that.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Last but not least, you had another piece of wisdom to share, and I thought this was interesting, is looking at the last 10 communications that you've had. And hopefully you are using that CRM tool, and you can do this. And if you go back through and you're like, wow, it's been 2 years, that 10 has been over 2 years. That's probably a problem, right? I mean, versus saying that 10 has been over 10 weeks. That's another problem, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good benchmark, is to take a look at the last 10 pieces of communication, and you can look at them per kind of lane, if you will. So what were the last 10 on each of our social media platforms? Okay. What were the last 10, through Constant Contact or our CRM? I doubt that you're going to have a last 10 direct mail, but maybe you do. So what was the last 10 direct mail, and what, just kind of what were we asking? What were we sharing?
Mhm.
With folks. Oh, it got dark in here.
I know.
With folks, there's
Well, you are.
a storm about to go by, I think.
Well, you are in the land of the tan because you are from Florida. So I'm just telling everybody.
It's true.
I love
It's
it.
like an eclipse or something just happened.
Your message is so powerful. It's changed the trajectory of the sun. Yeah, I think this is good. Now, when as we finish up, I hadn't thought of it, Tony, as looking at your last 10 communication, if you will, tracks or streams. I had been thinking about per donor, like opening up that CRM and saying, what were the last 10 things that we did for the donor? But I think it's a healthier way to go, looking at the tools that you're using in the streams of communication. I think
Mhm.
I like that. I like that a lot more because that's more holistic and a path that then you can meld into your strategy for the whole organization, right? I think that if you have been using your CRM and you've been vigilant and diligent about putting in that information, you can go to your CRM before a meeting or just in general and determine per donor what the course of communication has been.
Yeah, but
But
I love your approach too, though, about, per donor. And maybe again, it's just looking at doing an audit of the top
yeah,
10% of donors and kind of auditing what that looks like.
yeah,
Because
you know,
there will still be a learning in that, whether it's an affirmation that, it looks good and you're doing things the way that you would like for them to be done, or
right.
just, realizing that there are some opportunities for improvement.
Right. I think you unlocked a lot of my stress by being very honest and strategic with that top 10%. Because you can start there, look at that, and then maybe you do the opposite. You do the bottom 10%. And then you try and figure out, okay, wow, what's the difference here and what's going on?
Hmm.
Because you can then move through the different segments of your donor population, and I think that's a great way to do it. I don't know if it's my brain, but I think it's like all or nothing, right? And so it's really easy to get overwhelmed.
No, it is, yes. Well, and kind of in the spirit of equity, we want to treat everyone the same, right? So, our low, middle, high end donors, we all want them to feel great about
Yeah,
their contribution. And we don't
yeah,
want any of them to feel like they're a number or a transaction. So I think that's why you and many people, myself included, take that holistic approach whenever we think about doing anything. That all
it's
or nothing is because, we're mindful around equity, and we want everyone who contributes to our organizations to feel equally valued.
right, exactly. Well, I feel equally valued with you in our life and with all the work that you do for our sector. We are so fortunate to have you uh, with us, on all this thought leadership that you do. And this includes the book that you and I collaborated on, The Architecture of Fundraising. It's building a career, it's developing relationships and structuring success. It's a great read. It's available on Amazon for $19.99. It is something that I think is a fabulous tool, no matter where you are in that arc
Mm,
of fundraising, whether you're a board member, you're a C-suite leader, you're a professional fundraiser, or thinking about getting into it.
right.
We want to encourage everybody to get into our profession because it's
Yes.
really important. We love your questions. We love your feedback. If you've got thoughts and things that you want us to talk about, reach out. info@AmericanNonprofitAcademy.com. As I always like to say, hint, hint, that goes right into the mailbox of Kevin Pace, our executive director, so executive producer. Hey, and again, we want to thank our presenting sponsors. They are amazing. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Intuit QuickBooks. Tony, we're marching towards our 1,600th episode.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
Well, thanks. So these people have been with us. Most of these folks have been with us since day
It's
one.
true. A lot of those logos have been there since day one.
Yeah. And so super cool. And we're very proud of that. And
Yeah,
that's
we should
because
be.
we have a great following and content and leaders that really believe in what we do in the nonprofit sector, like we believe in you, our viewers and listeners. We end each and every episode with this message, and it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well. Thank you, Tony.